Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, The Future of Trade and Connectivity in Asia, Views from the Quad Countries. We have participants joining us from all over the world today, including a number of our friends and colleagues, not only from the US and Asia, but many other countries around the world. So if you've gotten up early or you've stayed up late to join our conversation, thanks for taking the time to be with us. The NCAFP, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, has hosted a series of programs over the past few weeks with scholars and experts from each of the Quad countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Each program focused on different discussion topics, including how we cooperate on regional security issues, assessing the progress that the Quad countries have made, and perhaps what would be the future direction of the countries. During today's program, our panelists will discuss how they view regional trade and investment trends among the countries in the current geopolitical environment. They will also focus on how the United States Indo-Pacific Economic Framework aligns with the interests and needs not only of the other Quad countries, but of the other countries of the Indo-Pacific region. And finally, our panelists will explore the opportunities for and challenges to effective economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So just a few technical points before we start. If you do have a question during today's discussion, please, we ask that you use the Q&A, not the chat box. So if you look down at the lower part of your screen, type your question into the Q&A box and our moderator will read questions and we'll try to get to as many questions and answer them as the program time will allow. Also, as a reminder, today's program is on the record and is being recorded. And we will make it available for those, if you know people who aren't able to make today's program, it will be available online on our website, the ncafp.org, and our YouTube channel in the coming days. So as you can see from the screen, we've assembled a great panel of experts for today's discussion. The moderator of today's discussion is Susan Thornton, the project director of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Forum on Asia-Pacific Security. For those of you who perhaps don't know Susan, she's a retired senior U.S. diplomat with almost 3 decades of experience with the U.S. State Department in Eurasia and East Asia. In addition to serving in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs as the acting Assistant Secretary of State, Susan also served in leadership positions in U.S. embassies in Central Asia, Russia, the Caucasus, and China. So given her broad background, I was very fortunate to be able to know and work with Susan during our time in the State Department. So I was thrilled that she was able and had agreed to join us here at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And in addition to being the director of our forum, she's also a senior fellow and visiting lecturer in law at the Yale University's Paul Tsai China Center, where she's broadcasting to you tonight. You can see her beautiful background is in some library at Yale. And she's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So we're very honored to have all our panelists tonight participating in the discussion, and Susan will introduce the rest of the panelists to you. So once again, thank you for participating in today's program, and Susan, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thanks so much, Susan, and thanks for that warm introduction, and thanks for noting the background, which is the Yale Law Library. I'm broadcasting from New Haven tonight, but we are so excited tonight to have with us four stellar experts to talk about our topic, which is the future of trade and connectivity in Asia, views from the Quad countries. And if you don't know which the Quad countries are, we're going to introduce our experts. We have one from each of them. First up, we have Shiro Armstrong, who is an economist and an associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australia National University. He's a director of the Australia-Japan Research Center, editor of the East Asia Forum, which provides a lot of good information for all of us. He's the director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and research associate at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business at the Columbia University Business School, Columbia, New York. and he's also a visiting scholar at Keio University in Japan. Also with us tonight, we have Wendy Cutler, who is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of the Asia Society's Washington, D.C. office. Wendy joined the Asia Society after her illustrious career of almost 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, in the U.S. government, where she was acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative and worked on the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. We also have with us Noako Munakata, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. She served as a commissioner of the Japan Patent Office until July 2019, spent 2 years in Prime Minister Abe's office as executive secretary, and while at the Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, she worked extensively on trade policy, including Japan's participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And last, but certainly not least, we have Amatandu Palit, who is a senior research fellow and research lead in trade and economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He's an economist specializing in international trade and investment policies, FTAs, supply chains, connectivity, cross-border data flows, all of the key topics we want to hit tonight, and of course the Indian economy. And he sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment, worked for several years in the Ministry of Finance in the government of India, and also in the Ministries of Industry and Civil Supplies, and is the author of too many books for me to name. So I'm so thrilled to have all of you with us tonight. And we certainly are looking at a very complicated global picture right now. And so being that all of you have extensive experience in government and in looking at economic questions, I think, one of the things we should talk about first up is, looking out across the geopolitical crises that we see now. We are seeing a threat to globalization as we've known it over the past several decades. The Russia-Ukraine conflict and the resulting Western sanctions, and not only Western sanctions, but sanctions that go much further beyond that, have disrupted global trade and supply chains that were already hampered and damaged by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we see growing protectionism and the securitization of trade and investment as countries move to sort of shore up their self-reliance, try to avoid single points of failure in their economies, and seek more tools to navigate the complex international environment. So I would like to start, and maybe I'll start with you, Naoko. I'd like to start and ask, how do you see the evolution of the global trading system in the current very complicated geopolitical environment? And how do you think countries will, if you look out into your crystal ball into the future, how will countries manage to navigate the sort of complex web that we see of things that are militating against globalization? And what do you think the impact will be? I think you're on mute, yeah.
Sorry. The global supply chains has been restructured due to the US-China trade conflict and COVID even before this Ukraine crisis. And the focus is now has been shifting from efficiency to resilience. And then this will be more the case from now on. But if I may step back a little bit, the Ukraine crisis brought about, unprecedented challenge, of course, but I think we have to understand this challenge to the rule-based order or liberal order is going to be a long game. And then to prepare for this long game, we have to show to the world the appeal of democracy. And then democracy cannot allow inequality and social division to stay. Democracy must show that they can solve various problems and achieve results. Domestically, governments have to provide people with prospects of better lives. globally, the liberal order needs to be updated to meet contemporary challenges. And then we also need to bring to our side a third force watching from the sidelines. Many countries in the region are focused on economic development and poverty eradication, and they want to choose what works and don't want to choose sides. And then we need a coherent and credible strategy to win the hearts and minds. Thank you.
Well, that's very interesting, bringing in the sort of governance aspects. And maybe I could go to you, Shiro, for your perspective on these questions too. I mean, it's a really complicated picture that people are trying to think about navigating with all of these cross-cutting kind of currents that we're facing.
Yeah, look, thanks very much, Susan, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's quite a distinguished panel, and it's a real pleasure for me to be on it. Look, addressing your question, yes, the economic sanctions on Russia would appear to be yet another big blow to and a disruption to the trading system. You've got pressure on food markets, energy markets elsewhere. But I just want to think through and talk through the implications for the multilateral trading system from these sanctions. And I think to do that, I want to differentiate between the coordinated economic sanctions and what we might see, what we have seen more of recently before this conflict of unilateral economic sanctions. Because I think the distinction, excuse me, is quite important. So the coordinated economic sanctions on Russia, they're instead of boots on the ground and direct military intervention from the United States and Europe and the West. I think they're justifiable because of a gross breach of international law, that is a war of aggression. I think one important lesson we can take away from this already is that interdependence is a source of strength, not a source of weakness. That is, if we don't have this interdependence between Russia and the global economy, Russia and Europe, United States and Europe would not have military, not have any weaponry except for military options. So I think for me, a working hypothesis here really is that these coordinated, largely multilateral sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia have the potential to strengthen the multilateral system. Now that's, as I said, a working hypothesis. It depends on a credible exit strategy from the sanctions, but you just have to contrast that to unilateral sanctions. And we've seen a lot of those, in fact, from the United States earlier on, but more recently from China against Australia. Let me use this example because I'm sitting here in Canberra. But the set of trade restrictions that the Chinese have put on Australian goods going into China. I think it's fair to say that these have backfired on China. They've enacted a big cost on Australian exporters, but Australian exporters have been able to find other export markets. And that is largely due to the open multilateral trading system, being able to find other markets. So the system has acted as a buffer for the Australian economy, and it works as a buffer for other countries. It blunts the use of economic weapons, and it really diffuses economic and political power. And this is what we, I think, have to keep remembering as the importance of the multilateral system, the trading system. It's going to be important for COVID-19 recovery, of course, but it is an external dimension of our economic resilience. And I said it's brought a big cost to China. I think that's pretty obvious reputationally, and it I think helped accelerate the process of the Quad becoming a leaders process. So, looking at it from a small open economy, as we say in economics, a country like Australia, really any economy that's not the United States of China, when large powers start ignoring established rules or norms, it's the open and contestable markets and the interdependence that acts as a powerful constraint and protection for these economies. So let me just stop there with the answer to the first question, but really I think there's a big difference between those coordinated sanctions and unilateral sanctions.
Great. No, thank you so much. And that's a really important point. And I'd welcome any, comments on the issue of sanctions and their usefulness, the strategy behind them, and how they are impacting sort of the global system, as you mentioned, Shiro. I mean, it sounds, Naoko made a point about sort of having to address issues of sort of inequality, so the sort of prosperity agenda, but also governance within the prosperity agenda. And Shiro, you've talked about sort of the things that militate against the sort of open global trading system. I'd like to come to you, Amitandu. I mean, I think that there is probably a tension here between those two things, right? Between the prosperity agenda, which I think conventional wisdom, at least among economists in the past, was that the sort of globalized trading system was a contributor to the prosperity agenda and has helped to lift so many countries, into the reaches of the middle class, or at least the sort of help developing countries improve their well-being. And now we see that there's potentially a kind of a threat coming from this more protectionist, more kind of economic statecraft driven search for tools that are used not specifically in the interest of promoting kind of trade and open systems, but more political agendas. I wonder, how do you see some of the issues that were raised maybe by Shiro with respect to the sanctions and the multilateral coordinated sanctions versus unilateral, and also just in general, the kind of global picture that we're facing. And it's been mentioned that, of course, it's right that, you see prices soaring on commodities as a result of the conflict, first of all. So, but then also because of the effort to keep up with and anticipate the effect of disruptions to the global economy. So how do you see all of this?
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to this excellent discussion. Thank you so much for your generous introduction. You're absolutely right. I think what we are witnessing, and this is where I put on my hat from the region and the part of the world that I come from, South Asia, where actually this entire idea about how much a multilateral trading system is able to secure and cover the distress and the anxiety that is being witnessed right now. And Ukraine and Russia are too close to South Asia, and also to a very large extent, in a sense, a party to the impact that is going on out there. For a country like India, fairly large displacement of students from Ukraine. There are issues that are arising on the food supply side. There are issues that are arising on the fertilizer sourcing side. There are major supply chains that are encountering distress. So even if we leave India out of this story for the time being on the account of the fact that it is a large economy, but if I pick up the point that you stressed, the prosperity versus the exclusion item, there are several countries in the region and around us who are probably trying to understand that where does this actually leave them, maybe 5, 6, 8 months down the line. I think, Susan, the biggest challenge over here is that medium and small economies continue to be anxious over the fact that conflicts are going to become more commonplace as we go ahead, number one. Number two, over the last 3 years or maybe a little before that, what we have seen, first, successive trade coercion agendas shaping in the world. Number two, trade restrictions coming in the wake of COVID-19. And now finally, a very different kind of restriction which is beginning to impact trade. Now, sanctions are necessary. The sanctions that have come in have a very important role to play. But there are impacts of the sanctions which are being experienced. Let's say, for example, on the shipping insurance, to what extent traders can cover shipping insurance by getting into various systems. Now, this is where I'm beginning to wonder at a personal level, and I'd be happy to hear other thoughts. Is the multilateral trading system of the WTO actually equipped to take care and address the large number of unexplored, unanticipated issues that are going to arise from here onward? And let's say, for example, when we look at the exclusion of Russia from SWIFT, and the fact that Russia still continues to remain a market with which several countries of the world remain engaged on the trade side. What does that essentially mean for those countries who continue to stay engaged? Does it mean that along with SWIFT, they stay engaged in the CIPS cross-border interbank payment systems, which is primarily dominated by the People's Bank of China? Do they stay locked onto both systems simultaneously? Do they have the capacities for doing those? Let's say, for example, in the Asia-Pacific region in Southeast Asia, I know of a large number of banks and financial institutions who raise a large number of resources in yuan-denominated transactions. And for them, perhaps, they have developed the capacities over the years following the integration between SWIFT and CIPS in dealing with both systems. But what happens to those other countries who have not really had those capacities? I think when we look at the multilateral trading system from this vantage point, from the point of view of countries who are really searching for the straws and wondering that where is the global trade agenda going to go now? I think the biggest concern is that in what ways can the WTO now come back to a position of contributing effectively to the interests and concerns of those countries who are on the periphery and fringes of conflicts that are taking place around them? Because they are year after year experiencing very odd ramifications of a variety of conflicts. And it's not just the physical manifestation of the conflict that is important, it's the risks surrounding those conflicts. It's the outlook around those conflicts, because even if this Russia-Ukraine conflict now ends in the foreseeable future, the ramifications of that conflict are going to continue. That is going to be felt through the trading relationships. And that is where probably, again, this sense that the way the global trading system is working, the multilateral trading system, is it essentially going to purposefully contribute to the agendas of only the major economies? Or is it capable of being truly egalitarian and inclusive? I think that is a question which is going to come back and haunt us over and over again. Thank you, Susan.
So thank you, Amatandu. I think you raised this question about the increase in numbers of conflicts, and really the Ukraine conflict with Russia. I mean, the Russian invasion, the watershed that it presents, and everyone's commented already on this, is that it's a way of fighting a war without using military tools. And it's really the first time that we've seen that. And if you are right, that we're going to see a lot more conflicts, then I guess the question is, are these conflicts going to be relying more on these economic tools? Which brings us to Wendy, the question of, what is the international trading system going to be able to do to cope with this? And I guess the question that Shiro raised too about interdependence being a good thing, because we can use it to, as tools to deal with conflict short of military tools, which is a good thing in some sense, but it's also a limited tool, isn't it? Because how often can you use this interdependence as a tool in conflict before countries start to put up the walls that we see them starting to put up to protect themselves against the use of these tools in conflict? So they don't want to make themselves, they won't leave those vulnerabilities open. But what about the question of sort of the WTO's ability to cope, and how the sort of future looks of some of these tools, and is the usefulness of these tools going to be able to continue in the face of countries trying to sort of block them now?
Well, thank you. It's a lot of questions. And
I know,
listened to my distinguished
impossible.
colleagues and trying to kind of absorb everything they're saying. But I think what we'd all would agree, we're really in uncharted waters here. And in my view, this is a real turning point in not only in foreign policy, but in foreign economic policy, and frankly, in global trade policy. And, I always try and be an optimistic person, but I think here, what I'm taking away from this is that we're going to see the increased irrelevance of the World Trade Organization. I think the WTO was already under stress before the Ukraine war. And now, my understanding is in Geneva, it's hard to hold meetings when you have two countries at war in the same room. Some of the meetings just being called off and folks leaving. So I think it's a system under a lot of stress. And I think what we're going to see as a result, not the abandonment of the WTO, but more kind of the WTO kind of drifting to irrelevance and being more like the UN, and groupings of countries coming together to make new rules and to kind of forge their own order. And we're going to see some fragmentation. I think the Quad is one grouping that is already working on some of the key emerging issues. And we're going to see other groupings of countries as well. At the same time, let's just keep in mind, trade flows continue. And even during the US-China trade war, with like, we have tariffs now on about $350 billion worth of Chinese imports. Our two-way trade with China last year hit record levels, right? That we haven't seen in about 10 or 15 years. So trade will continue, but I think the notion that the World Trade Organization is going to be able to continue to update the rules and to, to be responsive to members' concerns about different issues. I just don't see the WTO being able to produce those types of outcomes that they did in the past. And that is going to mean that different groupings of like-minded countries will need to come together and to forge rules among themselves, and hopefully leave the architecture open so other countries that are willing and able to, live up to the rules would join over time. But that's about the most optimistic I can be at this moment.
I always try to be optimistic too, Wendy. So it's getting harder though for us. I want to remind our viewers, our audience tonight, to please, if you have some questions that you want to pose to this incredible panel of experts, please put them in the Q&A box. Use the Q&A function, and we'll get to those very shortly here, I hope, after we have maybe one or two more rounds of discussion. And please feel free, panelists, to jump in if you hear something that you want to follow up on, or put up two fingers and I'll call on you to follow up on a point that a colleague made. But I want to go now to Wendy's comment about the fragmentation. The Asia-Pacific region and the Indo-Pacific region has been a region where countries, especially in recent decades, have really pursued pretty actively regional economic integration. And right now in the Asia-Pacific region, we have these two mega regional trade initiatives that are both moving forward. They are both moving forward without two of the big members of the Quad grouping, US and India, while Japan and Australia are both in the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the comprehensive something on Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also progressive, comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So these two big regional trade agreements that include two of the Quad members, but not two of the other Quad members. And so how does this affect, do you think, the trajectory of the trade arrangements in the region going forward? What do you think the impact of this will be? Is China's application to join the CPTPP? And also there's the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement that China has also said it wants to join. Is that a real prospect? And what would the prospects be for the US's recent initiative called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when you look out at the region and you see these developments? We've been talking up to now about sort of the complicating aspects of trade openness and globalization, but there are these efforts in the region to try to continue to pursue this. And I just wonder how you see those going forward. And so I don't know who wants to jump in on this, but Naoko, I mean, Japan is in both of these agreements. It's been the leader of the CPTPP, keeping that going in the face of a US pullout. And so Japan seems to be very, keen and dedicated to continuing to pursue this regional integration framework. So I'd love to hear from you, sort of how you see it from Tokyo and what the thinking is on your part about how this could go forward, and what about these other options that are out there?
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid I may sound hollow when I say this, but the US return to the TPP will solve many, many problems. And we must not forget what the TPP was for in the first place. In the WTO, as Wendy described, free riders can veto every update of rules and stall efforts for us to restrain state capitalism, for example. And then the thinking behind the TPP was to really gain leverage by creating a framework with like-minded countries outside the WTO. And as for China's application for CPTPP membership, China will not make it without substantive reform of its economic policies. CPTPP rules on labor, digital, and SOE are fundamentally different from China's domestic policies, and exempting anything they want under the national security exception would not be acceptable. The emphasis will not only be on their will to abide by the rules in the agreement, but also on their track record of compliance with past trade agreements. The CPTPP, however, was not mentioned by Premier Lee in the report on government activities in the National People's Congress, so its priority in China may have declined for now. And then before considering China's applications for membership, there is a question of whether the current CPTPP rules are sufficient in the first place. The TPP provisions were drafted before China began its rampant use of economic coercive measures mentioned by Shiro. And then in addition, insufficient transparency is limiting the effectiveness of subsidy rules. And we need rules that prevent authoritarian states from gaining strength at the expense of others. For instance, rules for human rights violations that would enhance predictability and effectiveness, while without shutting out Asian countries could be something to explore. I was also encouraged by the agreement in principle on a new transatlantic data privacy framework. Hopefully this agreement will accelerate OECD government access discussion toward agreement. If OECD principles are established, they may be the basis for updating digital trade rules in the future. The approach to protect privacy and civil liberties in the context of government access with the focus on the essential elements of due process, such as proportionality, transparency, independent oversight, and effective redress, as discussed at the OECD, would provide the most solid starting point. And then as for applications for deeper membership, China can enter it, I would say, if it wants to, because DEPA's ambition is not high, but it won't address, maybe difficult to address China's digital protectionism. Nonetheless, DEPA's progressive thinking, like new cooperation elements not found in existing high-level agreements, such as facilitating digital IDs, fintech, and e-payments, building trust in artificial intelligence, and digital inclusivity, may be worth considering as potential tools to engage a wider range of countries. It may inform updating the CPTPP and designing the IPEF. To make digital rules effective and attractive to many countries, however, we need three conditions, I think. One is the high-level rules in itself. And then two is the combination with market access. And three, effective enforcement supported by a guardian power. And this leaves the TPP with the US back in as the only option, I'm afraid. The IPEF is unfortunately understood in the region as a compromise alternative to the TPP. China is providing market access to its huge market with the RCEP. The US return to Asia without market access cannot match China's moves. Even though the US cannot provide market access in the short run, we can start from a dialogue and to hear out the interests and needs of Asian countries. So the US-ASEAN summit is a very good project, and then I hope it will be scheduled as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, so that was an incredible tour de force. Thank you very much for all of those comments, which I think are incredibly trenchant. But I want to go right to Wendy because I know that we've had discussions over the last few months about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework of the United States, and also the difficulties that the US is having politically to, pursue market access opening and trade agreements. So maybe if you could just respond, Wendy, to some of Naoko's comments. I mean, you saw my thumbs up on the US getting back into the TPP, but I'm sure that you're going to give us a reality check on that.
Well, of course. So I would love to just remind the audience, Naoko and I, we worked on TPP very early on in the negotiation, and she was just a real force in Japan before others got on the TPP wagon to really convince Japan that it was in its interest to pursue trade liberalization under the TPP. And it's just so ironic when I look back on where we are now, where the US is out of the TPP. Japan marshaled the other countries to conclude the TPP without us. And now China's applied to join the CPTPP, its successor, and we're not part of it. If you had told me this is where things would end up 10 years later, I would have told you were reading a science fiction book. This was not going to happen. But we are where we are. And the reality is that the United States now, under the Biden administration, has a very different view on trade policy in our past trade agreements. It views those agreements as they've kind of outlived their usefulness. They don't reflect the realities of the day. They don't address the concerns of our workers and our middle class. And as a result, they're not going to pursue traditional trade agreements. Now, at the same time, however, they have recognized that if we want to be part of the Indo-Pacific region, we can't just rest on our security ties and our political ties and our people-to-people ties, that we need an economic agenda. So then the question is, how do you shape an economic agenda which is different from a traditional trade agreement? And that's where this new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework comes into place. And it's going to be a combination of trade, but it will also include new and emerging issues, including resilient supply chains, infrastructure and decarbonization, and anti-corruption. As Naoko mentioned, though, with respect to trade, we're just going to be pursuing certain aspects of trade, but not kind of the core interest of many other countries when it comes to trade, and that is market access. And when it comes to countries like Japan and Australia, we know they're going to be very open and welcoming of this initiative because they want us back in the region economically. And they're willing to kind of, put aside, any concerns they'd have with the IPEF in order to get the administration back in the region with a strong economic agenda. But the success of the IPEF, in my view, it's going to be based on whether the United States can attract other countries in the region, particularly other countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia, including India, because these are the countries that they haven't signed up to all this stuff yet. They're still kind of on the fence between China's, China's vision of the world or state capitalism versus, where the US is. And so these are the countries that, again, in order to make this initiative meaningful and impactful, these are the ones we need to embrace, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, India, and others. Now, what's so welcome about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that now in Washington we're calling the IPEF is that it's going to take a flexible approach. So it's not going to say you have to join everything or you can't join. That was kind of the CPTPP approach. It's going to be more like the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is different modules and says to countries, you can sign up for some of the modules, some of the pillars, but not the other ones. And I think that will help. But what will be key to attract other countries is what incentives will the United States provide? If we're not going to be providing market access, what will be in it for these other countries? And that's where the United States, I think, is going to have to put up either some trade assistance funds, some capacity building funds, infrastructure funds, trade facilitation features, but it's going to have to come up with a package of incentives to really attract other countries to join the initiative. So this initiative is going to be unveiled soon, hopefully in April, and hopefully it will gain some momentum in the region. I fear that if it's not taken seriously and if it's not pursued at senior levels by the administration, that China's application to the CPTPP will become the main trade negotiation in the region. And I don't think that's in the US interest. So I hold out the hope that the IPEF will be substantial, countries will see benefits in it. And even though it's not a traditional trade agreement, let's be honest, a lot of the traditional trade issues are not the most pressing issues in the region, particularly, I would argue, supply chains, which are, presenting huge challenges to our companies and our governments throughout the region.
Thank you very much for that. And I just want to read out one of the questions from the audience, which is, I think, mostly been answered, although the part that you mentioned at the end, that holding out the hope, is probably the part that we can't answer of this question. But the question is, can the United States overcome its internal divisions to lead the creation of new international trade rules, keeping in mind the concerns of developing countries, who you all very rightly mentioned, which may conflict with what the domestic US stakeholders want, which gets to this issue of market access, opening, and the kind of political winds in Washington blowing against that. And I think, this IPEF is an effort to do what is possible politically right now. And hopefully it will get some traction. I think there's some very interesting aspects to it, but the question you raise about what's the incentive that's in it for countries in the region, hopefully some of our partners in the region will help us to find a way to make it as attractive as possible. And with that, I'll come to you, Shiro, to talk from your perspective about how you see the regional trade picture. And also, we do have another question about commodities. This picture has also gotten very complicated, as people have mentioned, but the role of agriculture, especially probably in light of this Russia-Ukraine conflict and the important role that they play in agricultural production. But the role of agriculture is very important. Also, of course, the role of energy and energy security has really come to the fore now in the last few months and created a lot of concerns in a lot of places. So any of those issues you want to touch on, Shiro, we'd be very eager to hear your comments.
Thanks very much, Susan. And yeah, look, I just mentioned that on the IPEF US economic engagement in the region, I completely agree with what Wendy and Naoko have said. Of course, Australia and Japan, but not just Australia and Japan. I think the rest of the region really does want and really need the United States locked into this part of the world economically. I think that's in all our interests, including the Chinese interest, although we have growing trade between the United States and China, despite all the difficulties, as Wendy mentioned. We know that the IPEF will likely be exclusive of China from what we see, and it won't be offering market access. But I think this is where many in the region don't want to choose between the United States and China. And for this to be a successful initiative by the United States, it should be an initiative that strengthens multilateralism and deepens interdependence. And I think all the things that Wendy said are spot on, and Naoko, and that's what I think the focus has to be. Now, that's from the US side. There's a lot of work to do in the region, of course, as well. I'll just start with the fact that we're all right. CPTPP and RCEP are quite significant achievements, I think, given the context of rising protectionism, given the context that Wendy mentioned of the weakened WTO and the uncertainties in multilateral trade. But this is where, without the United States, without India in these agreements, it's going to be important that we have this these agreements not to be inward looking, but to have open architecture, as was mentioned. So that sounds nice, but what does it mean? I think there's a lot of work to be done in this part of the world on not just expanding membership, but multilateralizing those provisions. That's not something it's easy to do. Maybe RCEP has a better chance at doing that. It's an ASEAN-centered agreement, and ASEAN has a good track record of multilateralizing its free trade agreement preferences in ASEAN. And RCEP has an economic cooperation agenda as one of its pillars that creates a framework or platform to be able to talk about that and negotiate that over time. So there is hope there, I think. And just on China and CPTPP, this is China. You ask, is it real? Its bid? Well, you can read it any number of ways. One way to read it is China's putting its hand up for the rules-based order. Another, you could be a bit more cynical, but I think this is where we have to test Chinese reform resolve. And in fact, I would argue, encourage China in that direction as much as possible. It will require significant reforms, as Naoko said, but those reforms, if we can lock them in, will address many problems that foreign companies have in China, in operating in China. I think it's in our collective interest to expand CPTPP, including China, but importantly to keep standards high. And I think that's where Canberra and Tokyo are going to be doing significant work. And I hope it's closely coordinated work and the heavy lifting there to make sure that there aren't big exemptions and gaps, as Naoko mentioned, for China to be able to avoid proper SOE reform, state-owned enterprise reform, to avoid other reforms that we really want. So I think this is an opportunity. Australia has leverage in this case. Australia, every member of the CPTPP can veto new members. This is where I think it's an opportunity to get those sanctions from China on Australian imports lifted, and to work towards an agreement where it's not just more rules and meshing Chinese economy into more rules, but into more markets as well. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you very much. And Amitando, I want to come also to you on this question, also maybe about the issue of how important is the threat to sort of commodity trade that you see going forward. We have a question from one of our audience members about the role of agriculture. I'd also be curious about how India is seeing the role of energy and multilateral trade and agreements going forward, but also just the question of what do we have to be mindful of, or what are we missing in terms of the needs of developing countries, countries in the Indo-Pacific region, countries in India's region, and particularly with respect to both trade, not just trade though, also development and infrastructure, because this has been a focus among the Quad countries, certainly been a focus for China through its Belt and Road Initiative. But I think it's really important that amid all of the crises that we see happening in the world, that we are not missing what's happening in developing countries. So I don't know if there's any of those topics that you want to touch on, but I welcome your perspectives on this.
Thank you, Susan, so much. And let me at the outset begin by saying that I agree with most of what my panelists have shared today, particularly Wendy's views on how the United States needs to approach the IPEF. But when you go back to the original articulation of these four countries, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, and they're working together in the IPEF out of the vision of the Quad, I think there's a unique opportunity that is here. The balance of wisdom within these four members is very interesting. Japan and Australia have been very embedded in the regional projects that have been going on in the Asia Pacific. the RCEP, the CPTPP, Japan and Australia really have been at the forefront of actions. India and the United States have been outside of these work in progress issues. But I think what India and the United States bring to the table, very interestingly, Susan, is that having their large domestic economies and the kind of complex issues which those economies generate with respect to trade perspectives in the modern world is something which is very, very important to be noted. So I think the experiences are contrasts by themselves on what the India and the US perspectives have between them and what the Japan and Australian perspectives have between them. And to that extent, the Quad is actually beginning from ground zero. It does not need to inherit the legacies of either the CPTPP or the RCEP. It can always learn from the way these have progressed, but it can really take a very exclusive view on where it wants to go. And I think this is very essential. This is very essential because, after all, the fundamentals of the Quad have been very different. Now, when we look at, let's say, for example, the CPTPP or the RCEP, and you alluded to the question of the membership on China, I'll put on my outsider's hat in this regard, and I'll simply argue that, look, if the objective for both these agreements is to expand, then there is one way of looking at the candidature. But if the objective is to actually understand whether the applying member will be very serious in adhering to the roles and rules that becoming a member require, and whether the member will actually be serious in becoming a part of the community which that agreement comprises, then the application needs to be thought through very, very carefully. You mentioned the IPEF. Wendy brought up a large number of issues. And I think the most important point, in addition to what the IPEF is already trying to do, the issues have been very well lined. I think what the world is looking forward to, and when I say the world, I mean a large number of small and medium countries who are looking at the way the IPEF shapes up, is actually policy coherence on a large number of subjects. Let's say, for example, there's a large amount of conversation going on resilience of supply chains. What exactly does that mean on paper? If countries are to diversify in sourcing and bring into themselves a different pattern of supply chains, what kind of rules do they need to lock onto? What are the trade facilitation requirements? And this is what I think is extremely important for the IPEF to give a signal and a direction on that. Look, resilient supply chains between the major economies of the world can look like this. For example, A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth. They can propose similar standards when it comes to the digital trade, when it comes to clean energy. And finally, Susan, the point that you mentioned on infrastructure. Now, on infrastructure, and this is the point which I think is probably going to be the most challenging out of the 7 points that have been mentioned in the IPEF. The problem over here is that this is where the Quad members are going to have to step into third country markets. And when they step into third country markets, they encounter a very different set of issues. There's already an existing set of alternatives that are available in terms of the way the infrastructure projects are shaping, in terms of the way their rate of returns and feasibilities and shelf lives are being determined. On top of that, there are now sustainability questions that have been brought onto the table. There are questions attached with the movement of people on those projects. Now, the issue that I think is really going to become critical over here is that the 4 countries will first need to think it through between themselves to what extent and where are they comfortable in collaborating. I think there could be areas, let's say, for example, India and Japan have made some efforts to work in a country like Sri Lanka, which again is a hotspot of the BRI. But to what extent can that initiative be reproduced in other countries? I can sense discomfort when, let's say, for example, the Quad members talk among themselves that, look, we could be happy going in X, but not too happy going into Y. And this is where the point that Wendy mentioned, by what extent can other countries be drawn into the IPEF and its saliency becomes very important. And I'd like to come back to the question of the standards again. I think standards remain by far the biggest source of ambition for this framework, because unfortunately, standards are something which the WTO is not able to provide at this point in time. It is missing out on standards, and the Quad and the IPF has a great opportunity to come up on this, lay down the templates and the baselines, and take other countries with. Back to you, Susan.
Great. No, thank you. I'm really curious. We had, as Susan Elliott mentioned at the top, a couple of roundtable sessions among Quad countries on various issues pertaining to what the Quad has done together so far and where might it go in the future. And I thought it was pretty unanimous that people felt that working jointly as countries within the Quad on infrastructure projects in third markets is really complicated and wasn't working very well for the reasons that you exactly mentioned, Amitandu. So I thought that was very interesting and just wanted to mention that and see if that resonated with any of you. But the other thing I thought was really fascinating that someone raised, and of course, the Quad really came through in our roundtables, has these two elements. The first is this kind of strategic leader level dialogue that focuses on sort of regional security challenges and other strategic issues. But then we have the 4 working groups on the various areas: climate change, technology, the vaccine effort, et cetera. But people felt that another good sort of project for the Quad would be to try to bring the sort of like-mindedness in even greater alignment around certain topics. And one of the topics was kind of climate change ambition. And Shiro, I won't mention any particular countries here, but one country was mentioned as, a potential target for this kind of an effort in sort of pushing for greater policy alignment. And then I think another area was, of course, on sort of free trade. And India was mentioned in terms of market access and opening and sort of coming into greater alignment maybe in that area. And I think probably also for the United States, there have been a lot of unilateral moves by the US recently on trade matters that could be worked in the Quad. And this is kind of a trusted, private, small group where we could actually have these frank conversations. And I wonder if any of you have reactions to that. Wendy, what do you think?
So I wanted to pick up on one point that Amitandu made, and that is the need for coherence. Because if you look at the IPEF agenda and you look at the working groups of the Quad, they overlap, right? They talk about supply chains, they're talking about advanced technologies, they're talking about infrastructure. And then if you look at other dialogues the Biden administration has launched with other countries, like the recent 2+2 economic ministers initiative with Japan, it's kind of the same type of agenda. And so I think it's going to be really incumbent upon the United States and others to really coordinate all of these different initiatives and to make sure that outcomes are achieved and not just everyone's going to meetings to discuss all this stuff. And one of the reasons I was so impressed with the Quad early on and the outcome from the leaders' meetings was that they weren't just talking about stuff, that they actually, they put together early on a very ambitious vaccine distribution program. I think the more the Quad can produce concrete initiatives, the more credible it will be, and it will set itself up for being able to take on tougher issues. I personally think there's a role for trade in the Quad. I note that India and Australia are very close to announcing some kind of partial trade deal that would lead to a more comprehensive trade agreement later on. And I also note that Japan and Australia, they have a free trade agreement. And, maybe there's something we can all do on trade together, but kind of without all of the, all of the baggage that everyone has, and see how we can kind of build up and work on some of maybe the easier issues like trade facilitation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the Quad, But I think in all of these dialogues, it's just important to be able to show concrete, tangible outcomes that can be achieved, and not just establishing more working groups and more dialogues and more meetings.
I've read a article recently on how to stop having so many meetings, and what you say resonates a lot with me in this area. It does feel like there's a lot of forum creation and discussion of brainstorming of ideas, but we do have to get down to work at some point too and come up with the list that coheres for these 4 countries, right? And focus the work effort around those and actually, do the production. And I agree with you. I thought the vaccine initiative was terrific as a first outcome for the Quad, and we need to figure out, I guess, how to make that work out, and then how to move to the next concrete item. Shiro, do you want to come in here? I've named you and shamed you in connection with climate change, but not you personally, of course. But do you have any thoughts on these issues?
Absolutely. Thanks, Susan. And yes, rightly named and shamed, I think. And that is, I think, one value that the Quad can and is starting to a bit show. And as you mentioned, I think it's not just getting like-mindeds together and the small grouping helps, but the peer pressure among the grouping, I think, to do better on all these facets. So, providing public goods in the region, providing global public goods is what this grouping can do, but it does hurt when 1 or 2 lag in each of the areas you mentioned. So I think that is something that well, at least I hope becomes a regular output of the Quad, where quietly behind closed doors we start to converge on some of these important areas. And I think another area, and I'll just bring it back to the infrastructure investment, because I think that's a key area where we've seen a lot of progress, although it doesn't look that obvious, but a lot of progress in setting the standards and getting the conversation right, I think, around governance. I think the starting point is a huge infrastructure deficit in the region. A lot of countries need more infrastructure investment. And competition is not a bad thing here, so long as the governance in the recipient countries is up to scratch. So I take a lot of heart in what Japan's been able to achieve, and I see Japan's leadership here as having been very important, and what other Quad countries can work with and learn from. And specifically, it's around Japan's initiatives with China. Now, through the G7, Isejima, Japan's hosting of the G7, putting infrastructure standards, elevating those onto the G7 agenda, carrying those through to the G20 summit in Osaka, having, of course, other countries sign on. And in the second Belt and Road Summit in China, the Chinese were using very much the same language as the G20 there. And you've got the PBOs, People's Bank of China, working with the IMF to think about how to structure these lending vehicles better. And on top of that, I think Japan has effectively shaped Chinese infrastructure standards from outside the Belt and Road Initiative. So those 50 plus joint infrastructure projects that Japan and China agreed to, and some are underway in third markets, I think that's a really positive sign. Of course, Australia is in the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well. And so I think all this shows that there are openings to shape behavior of Belt and Road lending. Now, it's not going to solve all our problems, but I think the comparative advantage of this grouping is in helping countries improve governance and shaping norms and standards globally.
Yeah, that really does resonate also with me. I do think there's been tremendous progress made through all kinds of different vehicles, both the efforts that Japan has made on infrastructure development in the region, but also, as you said, the sort of peer pressure, naming and shaming kind of things that also can help. And I definitely think that there's certainly room among the Quad countries. I think one of the signature, maybe the signature for the Quad countries is this, efforts together to provide more public goods. And I think that is a perfect kind of way of thinking about the sort of below the leader level interactions among the Quad. And I think we've seen progress on that. And if we can keep that up, that will be terrific. We have, just about 10 more minutes, and we have a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw these out. Go ahead, Naoko, two finger, go ahead.
My proposal to, advice to, avoid too many meetings is to go out to the field and then talk to the people. And then we have to start from understanding our customers. And then Japan is now involved with ASEAN on co-creation projects. And then we have three big themes. One is accelerating energy transition. And then second is enhancing ASEAN's attractiveness as a hub of supply chains. And then this, of course, entails the resilience of the supply chains. And then the third is creating innovations that enhance sustainability and solve social issues. This is beyond infrastructure. And I think to serve our customers, we have to be able to solve their problems. And then that's the starting point. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I like that customer is always right. Customer-based service is definitely the way to think about it. And listening more, I think the Quad can actually help some of the country members of the Quad to make sure that they're listening more to what's going on out there in the world, especially as I mentioned earlier with Amitando in the global South. We have to make sure that we're keeping our finger on the pulse of what's happening out there. I'm going to do this rapid fire last few questions. A couple of them harken back to our conversation at the top about sanctions and the impact of sanctions. One is about what is the chance for a push for de-dollarization from certain countries that might be facilitated even through like the SCO or the BRICS. I think, Amitando, you talked about the CIPS system, that is the Chinese comparator to the SWIFT system. It's gotten a lot of play in the context of the Russia conflict and Russia-China linkages, financial linkages, but that's one question about the dollar-denominated trade facilitation and dollar-denominated financial system in the globe. Second question is about what I think Shiro you mentioned early on, this coercive use of economic measures or sanctions that we've seen from China. This question is particularly with regard to Taiwan and China's, as we all know, major sensitivities with respect to Taiwan, and what is the prospect for increasing sanctions, I think, as those we've seen meted out against Lithuania in particular in response to a Taiwan-related issue. Is Taiwan, as tensions raise over Taiwan, is it going to become a third rail issue for trade? And then another question is just about the general question of greater protectionism as we see this fragmentation that Wendy talked about into regional trading blocks. What kind of greater protectionism on a global basis are we likely to see? So I think that those were all the questions. I had a question too myself about climate change. With everything going on in the global economy and the trading system, it seems that a lot of countries were counting on efforts to meet their climate change goals in terms of job creation at home, in terms of advancing domestic innovation. And I just wonder, if we're looking out at the global picture, what are the chances that climate change efforts and efforts to develop green technology are going to be kind of interfered with, and especially the global cooperation that's going to be needed to tackle the climate change issue? Is that going to run into the buzzsaw of kind of domestic, trade protectionism, sanctions, et cetera? So those are 4 questions. I don't know if anyone wants to start off. Maybe Amitando, maybe we can come to you to lead off our final rapid fire round here.
Thank you, Susan. I don't claim that I'll have the last word on this particular query that I'm looking to address, but just the challenge to the dollar. Susan, the point is that, look, I think it's pretty much obvious that the context of the conflict, and let's stay limited to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's created a situation where Russia is obviously going to look for options. Along with Russia, there are other countries which might be forced to look for options. China is pretty much there as a provider of certain kind of options. Now, I don't think that the threat to dollar is really going to arise in a conventional form. But having said that, I think we need to accept the fact that when we look at digital currencies, let's say sovereign digital currencies, the United States and much of the West has really not been able to keep the pace up with the movements that have been happening in a large part of the Asia Pacific. Today, we have 15 economies, all of them large: Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Korea, for example, who are pretty much there as far as pilots of their sovereign digital currencies are concerned. And I suppose when we get to see the exchanges operating between these currencies in terms of the interoperability across borders, and pilot projects are already on, they will clearly bring in much more of the yuan, much more of the ruble and other alternative currencies. And that might just create a certain push for the digital dollar. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here, the digital dollar. So I think to that extent, there might be a sense of urgency which is required in the United States now, and so far as the regulations around the digital dollar and its movements are concerned. And we also probably need to reflect on this fact at some stage within the IPEF and the Quad. And I think one of the areas, and I'd just like to add this as a final thought on my part, one of the areas where the IPEF can probably stand to make a significant contribution is, for example, if a particular project is picked up, let's say, with the digital economic rules of cross-border trade or the digital economic partnership. And even if there is a proposal to establish something like a standard digital signature or digital trust marks in connection to the cross-border payment systems, I think that will really, really make a very important move forward. Back to you, Susan.
Okay, I love it. A big proposal here for the Quad to take up. Shiro, let's come to you next.
Thanks, Susan. Those are all very tough questions. Let me just follow on the dollarization, de-dollarization issue. I think, it's yet to be seen what happens out of this round of unprecedented multilateral sanctions, including financial sanctions. But I would argue that perhaps this might come back to what I started with, my working hypothesis. These set of sanctions may strengthen the role of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Now, you can imagine if we return to a world of Trump or a Trump surrogate, where there's more arbitrary unilateral use of economic weaponry, that would shake confidence in the use of or the holding of US dollar reserves. So I think US dollars appreciated. A lot of countries are still holding US dollar reserves. I don't think this round has hurt the US, this round of sanctions has hurt the US dollar in its status there. If the Chinese want to try to find an alternative with Russia, that's a very small world compared to who's joined the sanctions. So I hesitate to start to answer the other questions given the time and the experts on this panel. So I might leave it there, Susan.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I guess this gets to the issue of the question of the dollar as the reserve currency versus the electronic payment system and some of the financial innovation in fintech that we're seeing. And the US, I think it's fair to say, is a bit behind on that, certainly when it comes to comparing with other Asian economies. And there's been some concern expressed, even I know in the US, about making sure that we stay ahead of the game on that. But on the de-dollarization, I mean, I think what I've basically heard recently is that there's been a flight to the dollar since this conflict broke out. So that would sort of be some evidence in favor of that theory. I guess the question is on overuse of unilateral sanctions. That would make it maybe less attractive to hold the dollar. Let's go to you, Naoko, for if you want to talk about de-dollarization, great. If you want to talk about any of those other questions, fantastic.
Okay, I would talk about the protectionism And then I think the cure is actually is at home, each country. It's not the trade negotiations. We have to get the economic house in order so that we can be more generous vis-a-vis other people. And then to do so, the Biden administration's focus on middle class people is correct, but I hope that that policy go hands in hands with more outward oriented trade policy as well. Thank you.
Good comments. Thank you for that. And Wendy, you're going to get the last word.
So I just think here we need to look at the short term versus the long term. And if you look at just the sanctions that the West put on Russia, how quickly we did it, and also the depth and the breadth of these sanctions that were unimaginable and had never been used before, and how the Western countries marshaled together quickly and put these measures into effect. And I think this is going to lead Russia, China, and other countries to think, well, what can we do in the longer term to reduce our vulnerabilities, to reduce our dependence? I mean, China was already doing this with its dual circulation policy. So what worries me is that everyone's going to be looking more towards self-reliance, self-dependence, not letting others have a lot of leverage over them, including the United States. If you look at the push for reshoring of our supply chains, a lot of that is about, we want to control the production in the United States. We don't want to have to depend on uncertain, unpredictable sources overseas. And so this is just a trend that I think over the longer term, if groups like the Quad and other groupings of like-minded countries, or even the WTO, if they're not able to kind of move forward with these interconnectivity and trying to integrate markets, we may end up, I think, in a fragmented world.
Yeah, there's this tendency towards zero risk policies now, and the securitization of all economic transactions, which is, could be quite damaging for sort of global prosperity, I think, at a minimum over the longer term. But certainly right now, there are short-term objectives that, are quite urgent. And I think the sanctions that were put in place, it's extraordinary, the unity and the speed. I think nobody really knows what the long-term effects will be. So it's a bit of an experiment. But I really want to thank all of our experts tonight, our panelists. This has been such a great conversation. A lot of questions, great answers. Some we can't answer, but we hopefully can continue this conversation. And thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in, and wish you all, a smooth sailing and less bumpy ride than what we appear to be facing at the moment. So fingers crossed for that, and let's try to stay optimistic and hopeful. Thanks, everybody.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Good night.
Thank you.